The city cook held the spoon to the light, his face a mask of professional skepticism. On it shimmered a single, perfect teardrop of liquid, the color of autumn sunset. It was, he had been told, vinegar. He had come out to this dusty fringe of a town chasing a rumor, a thing he did not believe but could not ignore, for his reputation at the new hotel was built on finding the impossible. He'd tasted the watery, acidic offerings at the Mercantile and dismissed them with a Gallic shrug. Then the stable boy had mentioned the apple girl, and the rumor had taken root. A woman, alone, making something worthwhile out of the leavings of the town's orchards. He thought it a joke. Now he sniffed. There was no harsh chemical sting. Instead, it smelled of apples, yes, but also of honey, of oak, of the rich, dark earth after a rain. It was complex, a story in a scent. He brought the spoon to his lips. His eyes, which had been narrowed in judgment, flew wide open. It was sharp, yes, but the sharpness was a door opening into a warm, sunlit room of flavor. It bloomed on his tongue, a bright, clean acidity that gave way to a deep, fruity sweetness and a long, smooth finish that spoke of patience. He swallowed. He looked at the young woman standing before him, her hands stained, her dress plain, her expression unreadable. She just waited. He was a man of many words, but for a moment he had none. He finally found his voice, a reverent whisper. "Ma chérie," he breathed, his professional disdain melting into pure awe. "Where did you get this?" The woman, Eliza, looked past him, her gaze fixed on the line of scraggly trees that marked the edge of her property. A small, quiet smile touched her lips, a secret shared with the landscape itself. "I made it," she said. 6 months earlier, it had started with rot. It began with her kneeling in the muck and fallen leaves under the gnarled branches of Silas Croft's apple orchard, and the whole town of Providence Creek agreed she had finally, irrevocably, lost her mind. They watched her from the road, a solitary figure in a faded calico dress, her hands buried in the ruin of the harvest, and they pitied her. She was young, alone, and clearly not right in the head. To haul away what was only fit for pigs, and to do it for free, it was the act of a fool or a pauper so desperate she'd lost all sense of shame. They did not know that what they saw as the end of things, Eliza saw as the beginning. It was a simple proposition, one she made first to Silas Croft and then to the other orchardmen who owned the land that sloped down to the creek. The windfall apples, the ones bruised by their fall, pecked by birds, or already showing the telltale tracks of the codling moth, they were a nuisance. They had to be raked up and carted away before they soured the ground and drew wasps. It was a chore, another expense at the end of a long season. Eliza offered to take it off their hands. "I'll haul it all," she said, her voice low and steady, her gaze direct. "For free. You won't have to lift a finger." Croft, a man whose belly hung over his belt like a sack of grain, squinted at her. "What for, girl? You ain't got no pigs." The men with him chuckled, a low rumble of masculine amusement. "Maybe she aims to eat 'em," one drawled, and they laughed louder. Eliza didn't flinch. She just stood there, waiting, a small, still point in their sea of ridicule. Her stillness was more unsettling than any argument. "It's a fair offer," she said. "It saves you the labor." Croft thought about it. The girl was an odd one, had been ever since her parents passed and left her that worthless patch of scrub and thistle down by the dry fork. But the offer was sound. It would save him 2 days' work for 2 hired men. "All right, girl," he boomed, deciding to be generous. "You can have the trash, but my good apples. He jabbed a thumb toward the loaded wagons destined for the cider press and the market. "Those you don't touch." "I only want the fallen ones," Eliza said. The deal was struck. Word spread through Providence Creek before she'd even hitched up her old, sway-backed mare. Apple Eliza, they called her. The name was not meant to be kind. It was a brand, a mark of her folly. They saw her wagon creaking along the dusty roads, loaded high with what looked like garbage. Day after day she made the trip, from Croft's Orchard to Miller's, then to Patterson's. The loads were heavy, the work backbreaking. The smell of bruised fruit and fermenting sugars followed her like a cloud. The children would sometimes run behind the wagon, chanting the new name they'd learned from their parents. Eliza never looked back. She kept her eyes on the mare's drooping ears and counted. The arithmetic of survival was the only one that mattered. Each wagon load was another brick in the foundation of her plan. Each jeer was another gust of wind that failed to extinguish the small banked coal of her resolve. She was one person alone, and the town was a chorus of doubt. But the apples were real. They were heavy, and they were hers. Her land was 5 acres of stubborn clay and rock that had broken her father's spirit before it broke his heart. It grew thistle and burdock better than it ever grew corn or beans. The house was little more than a shack, tight against the wind but drafty in 100 other ways. But beneath the house, dug into the cool, dark earth, was a cellar. It was its one true virtue. Lined with flat, gray field stones her grandfather had laid a lifetime ago, it held the cold even on the hottest days of August. It was not a cellar, it was a promise. This was where she brought her treasure of trash. Down the rickety wooden steps, basket by basket, she carried the apples. The air, already cool, grew thick and sweet with their scent. In the main square, the men debated the price of wheat and the threat of rain. In the mercantile, the women gossiped over bolts of cloth. In her cellar, Eliza began the quiet alchemical work of transformation. She had no proper cider press, only a long, sturdy lever of oak she'd fashioned herself, a trough carved from a log, and the relentless force of her own body. She washed the apples in buckets of water hauled from her deep, reliable well. She chopped them, worms and all, with a heavy cleaver, the blade ringing against the thick chopping block. The good flesh, the bruised, the parts tunneled by insects, it all went into the trough. Then came the labor. She would brace the lever, put her weight against it, and press. The first trickle of juice was a miracle, a thin stream of pale gold liquid seeping from the pulpy mass. It was slow, agonizing work. Press, release, stir the pulp, and press again. Her shoulders ached, her hands grew raw, but she worked with a methodical rhythm, a prayer of motion. Day after day, the juice collected in huge stoneware crocks she had spent her last dollars on. The pulp, the pomace, she hauled back out and spread on a fallow patch of ground behind the house. Nothing wasted. The townsfolk, passing on the road, saw only inactivity. The fields lay bare. No smoke curled from a smokehouse chimney, no chickens scratched in the yard. They saw a place falling into ruin, confirming their judgment. A pity, they'd say, shaking their heads. Her father was a hard worker. They could not see the life teeming under the ground. They could not smell the slow, magical fizz of fermentation as wild yeasts from the apple skins began their work, turning sugar into alcohol. Eliza kept the cellar door shut tight, her secret held close in the cool, silent dark. One afternoon in late September, a visitor appeared at her gate. It was Mr. Anselm, an old German immigrant whose farm on the next ridge was a model of neat, intensive order. He was a quiet man, an outsider himself, who spoke in a thick accent and was said to hold to the old ways. He carried a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. Eliza stopped her work, wiping her hands on her apron. She was wary of visitors. Mr. Anselm did not look toward the house. He looked at the ground. He pointed a gnarled finger at the patch where she'd been spreading the pomace. "Das ist gut," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Good for the soil. Next spring this will grow fine melons." He had not seen a failure. He had seen a preparation. He held out the bundle. "My wife, she bakes too much." It was a loaf of dark, dense rye bread, still warm, and a thick slice of white cheese. It was the first gesture of kindness she'd received in months. She invited him to sit on the porch steps, and she brought him a glass of water from the well. They sat in silence for a time, a comfortable quiet that was a relief from the noise of the town. He watched her, not with the pity or scorn she was used to, but with a gentle, intelligent curiosity. Finally, he spoke. "The town, they say you haul trash, but the smell from your cellar, it is not the smell of trash, it is the smell of becoming." Eliza hesitated. The secret was a fragile thing. But something in the old man's eyes, a deep, knowing calm, made her trust him. She led him down the creaking steps into her subterranean world. The air was cool and alive with the scent of hard cider. The big crocks lined the walls, each covered with a cloth. Mr. Anselm inhaled deeply, a connoisseur of aromas. "Ah," he said, a sound of deep satisfaction. He walked to the largest crock and gestured for her to lift the cover. Floating on the surface of the cider was a pale, gelatinous disc, a strange, living thing. To anyone else, it would have looked like spoilage. Mr. Anselm nodded slowly. "Die Mutter," he whispered. "The mother." He reached out a gentle finger and touched its slick surface. "She is healthy." He turned to Eliza, his blue eyes bright. "In the old country," he said, his voice taking on the cadence of a proverb, "we have a saying, 'The best soup is made from old bones, the best soil from dead leaves, and the best life, it is made from what others throw away.'" He then gave her a piece of advice, a secret of the craft. "She needs to breathe, but no dust and no flies. A tight cloth, yes, but she must have air. It is the air that teaches the wine to sharpen its wits." He was telling her to encourage the acetobacter, the airborne bacteria that would convert the alcohol into acetic acid. It was the crucial, final step. He had validated her work and given her the key to perfecting it. The seasons turned. Autumn bled into a cold, hard winter, and then thawed into a muddy spring. In the cellar, the transformation continued. The sweet smell of cider slowly gave way to a sharper, cleaner, more penetrating aroma. The mothers in their crocks grew thick and opaque, living curtains that separated the alcohol below from the air above. Eliza tended to them like a shepherd with a flock. She learned their moods, the subtle changes in smell and temperature that signaled the slow, steady work of conversion. She was not making cider. She was making a true, living vinegar. By June, she knew it was ready. She siphoned a small amount from one of the crocks, letting the liquid run into a clean glass bottle. It was no longer pale gold, but a deep, rich amber. She held it to the weak light filtering through the cellar's single grime-covered window. It was clear and bright. She uncorked the bottle and smelled it. The aroma was sharp but clean, with all the complex undertones of the apples it came from. She touched a drop to her tongue. It was strong, alive, and utterly delicious. It had worked. All the mockery, all the labor, it had all led to this. It was a secret victory, savored alone in the dark. But a secret cannot feed you. She needed to sell it. It was around this time that Finn started appearing. He was a scrawny boy of maybe 10, one of the innumerable children from a family in town that had more mouths than pennies. He never came close, just lingered at the edge of the property, a small, watchful ghost. He'd seen her hauling the apples, had heard the jokes, but he didn't laugh. He just watched. One hot afternoon, as she was hoeing the patch of earth Mr. Anselm had admired, she saw him by the fence. He looked thirsty. "Boy," she called out, "come have a drink of water." He hesitated, then scurried over, his bare feet kicking up dust. She gave him a dipper of cool water from the well. He drank it down in 3 noisy gulps. His eyes, big and dark in his thin face, darted everywhere. He was fascinated by the quiet industry of the place, so different from the loud, chaotic poverty he knew. He pointed a thin finger toward the cellar door. "What's down there?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Most people would have lied, would have guarded the secret. But Eliza looked at the boy, saw the genuine curiosity in his eyes, and decided on the truth. "My work," she said. "Come see." She led him down into the cool darkness. He gasped at the sight of the giant crocks. He sniffed the air. "Smells funny," he said, but not in a bad way. She explained it to him. Apples, cider, vinegar. The mother. He listened, his head cocked, taking it all in. He didn't understand the chemistry, but he understood the work. He looked at her, then at the rows of empty bottles she had collected and cleaned. "Can I help?" he asked. From that day on, Finn was her shadow. He washed bottles until they sparkled. He cut corks. He learned to wield the siphon, his small, steady hands perfect for the delicate work. He was the first person to share her secret, and he guarded it with a fierce, silent loyalty. The first test came in July. A grand new hotel, the Prospect, had opened in the county seat 20 miles away. It had a French cook, a man named Jean-Pierre, who was notoriously particular. He sent word to Sterling's Mercantile in Providence Creek that he needed 10 gallons of the finest pickling vinegar for his cornichons, and he needed it immediately. Mr. Sterling, the owner of the Mercantile and the town's self-appointed arbiter of commerce, sent over his best barrel-aged grain vinegar. The vinegar returned the next day with a curt note. "This is fit only for cleaning windows. Do not send me your dishwater again." Sterling was humiliated. The story, of course, was all over town in an hour. It was Finn who heard it first and reported it to Eliza. "He needs the good stuff," the boy said, his eyes shining. "The real stuff." Eliza was hesitant. Her vinegar was her secret, her hoard. But the arithmetic was clear. She needed money for winter supplies. She bottled 2 gallons of her finest, the amber liquid glowing in the clean glass. She wrote a simple label, "Eliza's apple vinegar, made in Providence Creek." Finn, scrubbed clean and wearing his only decent shirt, was her emissary. He drove her little cart into the county seat, the precious cargo packed carefully in straw. He was told the cook would not see him. Finn, emboldened by his mission, simply sat on the hotel's back steps and waited. Hours later, the cook, Jean-Pierre, emerged for a smoke, irritated and weary. He saw the boy and the bottles. He was about to send him away when he saw the color of the liquid. It was the color of old cider presses, of autumn light. He took a bottle, pulled the cork with his teeth and sniffed. Then he called for a spoon. This was the moment that would echo back to Providence Creek. Jean-Pierre tasted the vinegar and his world tilted. He bought the 2 gallons on the spot, paying Finn in shining silver dollars, more money than the boy had ever held in his life. "Tell your mistress," the cook said, his voice full of a new respect, "that I will take all she can make, at her price." The news, carried back by a jubilant Finn, was a seismic event, but it was heard loudest by Mr. Sterling. The man who had laughed at the apple girl now saw her as a competitor. He arrived at her farm the next day in his polished buggy, his face arranged in a mask of false warmth. He praised her industry, her cleverness, then he made his offer. "A young woman alone. You can't be bothered with the messy details of business, bottling, transport," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "I'll make you a simple deal. I'll buy your entire production, for the whole year, right now. I'll give you a fair price, and you'll have cash in hand. No more worries." The price he named was laughably low, a fraction of what Jean-Pierre had paid. Eliza listened patiently. She looked at his condescending smile, at the greedy glint in his eyes. She thought of his mockery. She thought of her months of labor. She gave him the same quiet, steady look she had given the orchard men. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice even. "But my vinegar is not for sale. Not to you." He left in a fury, the mask slipping to reveal the raw anger beneath. He had tried condescension. It had failed. He would not forget the slight. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. A brassy, cloudless sky hung over the valley for weeks. The sun beat down relentlessly, baking the fields to cracked clay. The lush green of early summer faded to a uniform, dusty brown. The worst of it was the water. Providence Creek, normally a swift, clear stream, slowed to a crawl, its water warming in the sun, turning a murky green. The level in the wells dropped daily, and what came up tasted of mud and minerals. Then the sickness began. It started in the poorer quarters of town, down by the low-lying flats where the sanitation was worst. Dr. Adams called it summer complaint, a familiar, unwelcome visitor. But this year, it was different. It was virulent. It started with a fever and a deep, grinding ache in the belly, and it progressed with terrifying speed. The sickness spread from house to house, following the shared dippers and the contaminated water. The doctor, a good man worn down by years of fighting losing battles, was overwhelmed. His laudanum could dull the pain. His bismuth powders could try to slow the flux, but he could not stop the disease. Fear, a more potent contagion than any microbe, settled over the town like the dust. Stores closed. People stayed in their homes, seeing neighbors not as friends but as potential carriers of the plague. The daily rhythms of life ground to a halt. In the midst of the fear and the sickness, old knowledge began to surface, whispered from one desperate household to another. It was the wisdom of grandmothers, the folk remedies that predated Dr. Adams and his black bag. They spoke of boiled water, of cleanliness, and of vinegar. A spoonful of good, strong vinegar in a cup of boiled water, they said, could purify it. A rag soaked in vinegar and laid on a fevered brow could cool it. A few drops could help a roiling stomach find peace. Suddenly, everyone in Providence Creek needed vinegar. They descended on Sterling's mercantile, their faces etched with anxiety. Sterling, ever the opportunist, had a few barrels of cheap, harsh grain vinegar he sold for salting meat. It was thin, watery, and smelled of chemicals, but it was all he had. The supply was gone in a single morning. The town was dry, and the sickness was getting worse. It was then that their collective memory, jolted by desperation, shifted. They had mocked the apple girl. They had laughed at her wagon loads of rotten fruit. But the cook at the Prospect Hotel, he had called her vinegar liquid gold. It was not a formal delegation. It was a slow, fearful pilgrimage. They came not as a group, but as individuals, drawn by a shared and terrible need. The first was Mrs. Gable, whose youngest son was burning with fever. She stood at Eliza's gate, her hand twisting the fabric of her apron, her face a ruin of sleeplessness and fear. She had been one of the women who had laughed the loudest. Now she could not meet Eliza's eyes. They say you have vinegar," she whispered, her voice cracking. "My boy, he's so weak." Before Eliza could answer, another figure appeared on the road. It was Mr. Henderson, the blacksmith, a man as large and solid as one of his own anvils, but he seemed shrunken, his shoulders slumped in defeat. His wife had taken ill 2 days before. He was followed by others, a small, shuffling crowd of the terrified and the desperate, the very people who had scorned her. They gathered in the dusty road outside her fence, a silent, grim assembly. Just as Eliza stepped forward to speak, the clatter of a fast-moving buggy interrupted the quiet. Mr. Sterling pulled his horse to a dramatic stop, raising a cloud of dust that enveloped the small crowd. He leaped down, his face a mask of civic concern. He had seen the gathering from his store, had seen his opportunity. "Friends, neighbors," he called out, his voice booming with false authority. "I know you are worried. I know you are frightened. But we must have order." He strode to the gate, placing himself between Eliza and the townspeople. He turned to Eliza, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone, loud enough for all to hear. "Miss Eliza, a crisis is upon us. The town needs a leader. I will take this burden from your shoulders. I will buy your entire stock, all of it." He turned back to the crowd. "I will ensure it is distributed fairly, to those who need it most." He gave Eliza a sharp, meaningful look. "Name your price, my dear. In a time like this, any price is fair." The meaning was clear. He was offering her a blank check. She could gouge the town, become wealthy overnight, and he would be the instrument of her greed, taking his own substantial cut as the distributor. He was offering her a partnership in profiting from their misery. He was positioning himself as the town's savior, using her work, her foresight, her patient labor as his raw material. All eyes were on Eliza. The town that had mocked her was now at her mercy. The man who had tried to cheat her was now offering her the world. The silence was absolute, broken only by the buzz of flies and the low, pained cough of someone in the crowd. Eliza stood perfectly still. She looked at Mr. Sterling's florid, eager face and saw the naked greed in his eyes. She looked past him, at the faces of her neighbors. She saw Mrs. Gable, her face streaked with tears and dust. She saw the blacksmith, a strong man brought low by love and fear. These were the people who had called her a fool. They had laughed at her, but now their suffering was real and plain. She saw the arithmetic of their desperation. Then her gaze found Finn, who had come to stand beside her, his expression a mixture of fear and fierce loyalty. He was one of them, a child of this town. He looked at her, his eyes asking the silent question, "What will you do?" She took a deep breath, the hot, dusty air filling her lungs. This was the test, not of her vinegar, but of herself. She could be rich. She could have her revenge on Sterling and the whole town. She could make them pay for every jeer, every whisper. It was all there for the taking. Instead, she did the one thing Sterling never anticipated. She ignored him completely. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it cut through the tension like a clean knife. She spoke directly to Mrs. Gable. "How many bottles will you need for your son?" The woman blinked, stunned. I don't know. 2? "Finn," Eliza said, without taking her eyes off the crowd. "Bring 2 bottles for Mrs. Gable." Then she raised her voice so all could hear. "I have vinegar," she announced. "I will not sell it to one man. I will sell it to every family that needs it." A murmur went through the crowd. Sterling's face began to darken. Eliza wasn't finished. "The price," she said, her voice ringing with a new authority, "is 20 cents a bottle." A collective gasp. It was the price of common molasses. It was the same fair, honest price she had charged the rich French cook. It was a price for the bottle and a little for her work. It was a price that said, "I am your neighbor, not your predator." It was an act of such shocking, radical generosity that it left them speechless. Sterling finally found his voice, sputtering in disbelief. "That's madness! You could own this county. Are you a fool?" Eliza finally turned to look at him, her gaze cool and clear. "I have what I need, Mr. Sterling," she said. "What these people need is to get well." She turned her back on him, a dismissal more profound than any insult. She and Finn set up a small table by the gate. A line formed, orderly and quiet. People pressed coins into her hand, their eyes shining with a gratitude that was deeper than words. They were not just buying vinegar. They were being welcomed back into a community they had tried to banish her from. Sterling stood, alone and exposed, his greed a stark and ugly thing in the afternoon sun. He got back in his buggy and left in a cloud of impotent fury, his grand plan turned to ash by a simple act of decency. The vinegar was not a miracle. It was simply a tool. But in that time and place, it was the right tool. The townspeople, following Eliza's quiet instructions, boiled their water. They added a spoonful of the sharp, clean vinegar, purifying it, making it safe. They used it to cool fevers, to soothe aching stomachs, to clean their homes and their hands. The sickness, deprived of its easy path from person to person, began to recede. The fever broke first in Mrs. Gable's son. The news traveled as fast as the sickness had. Hope, a stronger tonic than any medicine, began its work. The town, slowly, began to heal. In the weeks that followed, a new kind of traffic came to Eliza's farm. People were not coming to buy, but to give. The blacksmith, his wife now recovering, arrived one morning with a set of heavy new iron hinges for her cellar door, forged with his own hands. Mrs. Gable brought a dozen jars of preserved peaches, her face glowing with a quiet, fierce gratitude. The miller left a sack of fine white flour on her porch. They were payments of a different kind, an accounting not of commerce but of conscience. They were apologies, offered in the form of quilts, smoked hams, and promises to help mend her fence come spring. She was no longer Apple Eliza, the fool. She was Eliza, the woman who had been right, the woman who had been kind when she had every right to be cruel. The next autumn, when the apples began to fall, she did not have to hitch her wagon. The wagons came to her. Silas Croft, his face humbled, led the procession. He and the other orchard men had organized it themselves. They brought her the windfall, the bruised, the imperfect. They unloaded it not as trash, but as a tribute, piling the apples in a small mountain near her cellar. They were no longer leavings, they were an offering. One afternoon, Mr. Anselm walked over from his ridge. He saw the line of wagons, the bustle of activity, the neighbors who had once mocked her now working alongside her, sorting apples. He saw Finn, a head taller now, directing the work with the quiet confidence of a foreman. He saw Eliza, her face smudged, her hands still rough, moving through it all with a calm authority. She was the quiet center of this new, thriving enterprise. Mr. Anselm stood by the fence, watching, a small, proud smile on his lips. He looked at the mountain of worthless apples, a testament to a truth the town had been forced to learn. He nodded, as if confirming a long-held belief. "The best life," he said, his voice a low rumble, just loud enough for her to hear over the noise. It is made from what others throw away. Later, when the work was done and the quiet returned, Eliza stood alone in her cellar. It was bigger now. The blacksmith and his sons had helped her expand it, digging deeper into the cool earth, lining the new walls with stone. The barrels stood in long, neat rows, a library of future vintages. The air was rich and sweet and sharp, the smell of abundance. She lit a lantern, and the soft light danced across the barrels, catching the deep, honeyed amber of the liquid within. It was quiet. It was safe. She was home. And it was more than enough.